Hello, I'm Antoine Belaieff and lead North America at FAIRTIQ, and I'm really thrilled to welcome Stephen Farber today. Stephen is a transportation geographer and spatial analyst at the University of Toronto here in Toronto, Canada, who has written extensively on equity, including equity with regards to transit fares, and recently authored an article on distance-based fares. I'm here with Stephen to pick his brain on fares and equity, as many governments around the world are rethinking transit fare policies while the movement for free transit is growing. So welcome, Stephen. We're going to start actually not with distance-based fares or free transit. We'll keep that for later, so stay tuned, but with cash up front. And the tradition that transit agencies have to require upfront cash load into a wallet and then ask customers to prepay for their fare. So you load cash and then you have to buy a ticket or a pass. So basically, front up money and make a decision about your consumption in advance. Do you see an issue with this model from an equity standpoint?
Oh, absolutely, and it's not just me. Equity-seeking groups have been arguing against cash upfront models, especially for transit passes, for quite some time. A lot of low-income families really need to make tough choices about how they allocate their limited resources each month. And it's very difficult at the beginning of a month to make a decision to load a monthly pass card up front with a couple of $100 in the case in Toronto, or getting there, rather than making a decision to go out and spend that money on other important things like groceries and medications for their children. So it does result in quite a hard decision that needs to be made, and really in a lot of inefficient spending on transit, as well as many families decide not to purchase the pass because of this reason, but then over the course of the month end up spending more than they would have in the long run on transit because they couldn't get the resources together at the right point in time in order to purchase that lump sum pass.
Okay, so we just heard that passes are not, or prepaying is not really desirable. They're vanishing quite quickly with the pandemic and new ways of working. People really not knowing how many days they will need to travel, not just white collars, but people's lives are becoming more and more flexible. So the advantage of passes is that they provide budgetary certainty to a household. So what do you think they could be replaced with? What have you seen that seems promising?
Yeah, I think that I think there's a couple of structures that achieve the goals of providing families with more flexibility while also keeping costs low and predictable for all parties, both on the revenue side of the transit agency and the household side, the user side. So something like a maximum fare expenditure per month has the same effect of a monthly pass, but customers are able to build up to it over the course of the month, and it comes into play if and when those customers end up using the services, at that higher level. I think that there can be a flat cap. There can also be more of a prorated rebate on transit expenses as people accumulate more and more trips over, say, a 30-day period. So maybe the base rate of $3 per trip applies, but as people are using the system more and more, we can start charging less and less per ride until someone reaches that maximum monthly fare, which maybe is at some value akin to what the monthly pass would have been in the first place.
Great. So we see a lot of these models emerging both on this continent, in North America, and in Europe. So it'll be really interesting to see what lessons are learned and how this information gets circulated among transit agencies that really have to deal with a very different business model shifting from getting more money upfront, and so managing the budgets differently. So another topic, as I said before, that causes a lot of discussions in the industry, but also in academic circles, is distance-based fares. So distance-based fares are very common on long-distance services, commuter services, but usually not on city services, or less common on city services, especially in North America. You've done some research in this area, so what did you find out?
Yeah, so I think that first of all, there's a history behind why different services developed with distance-based fares or flat fares. And a lot of that history also has to do with kind of the technologies for fare collection that have been available to, say, bus companies historically, versus technologies and ticketing that's been like applied by commuter rail agencies, and rail companies in general have always had kind of origin to destination prices associated with individual trips, whereas the complexities involved in a urban transit system that's multimodal and really has a lot of buses as well, especially, has kind of led systems more towards flat fares. The main concerns around moving local transit to distance-based fares, a distance-based fare structure, is whether or not such a movement would have disproportionate impacts on populations who really rely on transit for affordable mobility, and the risks associated with long distance trips becoming much more unaffordable for people living in poverty or other people kind of suffering from different forms of injustices in the transportation system. Rightly so, there's a lot of fear that those riders might be disproportionately negatively impacted by a big fare increase for long distance trips. Historically, that wasn't really considered to be a problem in North American contexts, where most communities like living in poverty were centrally located in the downtown and took a lot of didn't really take very long distance trips. If you think about a traditional okay, I'll nerd out for a second. A traditional monocentric city, the North American monocentric city was wealthier commuters coming in from suburbs, right, taking long distance trips, and poorer communities living in the central areas taking much shorter trips. In that setup, generally speaking, you could see distance-based fares as having like a positive impact on equity, meaning those who can afford more would end up paying more. All else being equal, those living in the center of the city who could afford less would need to pay less for their transit, and everyone, that does result in a more just distribution of the costs of the transit system. But really, over the last 30 years, we've seen a slow transition away from concentrations of poverty in inner cities. Inner cities are rejuvenated. Inner cities are gentrified. Inner city neighborhoods are becoming much more desirable, broadly speaking, for wealthier groups of people. And the result of that is some displacement into suburbs and less accessible areas, and areas that require much longer trips to get around. And that's where low-income populations living in suburbs really would be more negatively impacted by a change to distance-based fares. So it's a very, very nuanced discussion. It's not a solution that can be applied equally fairly in every city around the world. A lot depends on the local social geography of where different social groups live in the city that we're thinking of, that we're managing or thinking about implementing these fares. And it's never going to be a one size fits all solution, even within a specific region. I think that the risks associated with making long distance travel severely unaffordable for people is always going to require special subsidies or interventions to make sure that these equity concerns are handled really, really well from the beginning.
To put it another way, you could use distance-based fares to actually make short trips cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could use the capping that we talked about earlier to apply even a trip cap or daily cap, weekly cap, monthly cap. And so this becomes an interesting part of a toolbox along with capping to modulate pricing in a way to better target the different needs of different commuters, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I should have said that not only was the geography of where people concentrated, historically resulting in lower income families needing to travel shorter distances for their commutes, but also what we find is that low income transit users are using transit for many more of their daily activities compared to wealthier transit users who tend to just do the out and back work commute and then use their car or other modes of transportation for shopping and chauffeuring their children and going to appointments. Non-car owning families and especially low income families are using transit for all of those daily errands, right? And like you said, that means that a lot of their trips are relatively short distances within their communities, right? Much more so than wealthier transit users. So there would be a lot of benefit there to reduce the price of transit for a lot of trips that, say, constitute daily necessities other than the work commute. And that's a great news story. And we should be encouraging, policies that make the, freedom of mobility more widespread amongst transit dependent populations like that, right? But at the same time, we can't do it by severely limiting the freedom of mobility for low income families to travel greater distances for work, for appointments, for school, for their children, and things like that.
Great. And I have to correct myself because I did use the word commuter before and I meant transit users. And I love what you said. And it's really all about freedom and really thinking that as much as the car is the instrument of freedom for so many people in North America, for a very significant proportion of the population, especially in large cities, transit is freedom that connects them to their aspirations or their or opportunity. So something to keep in mind. So we've heard a lot about free transit. So why don't we just solve the problem altogether? Transit is already highly subsidized. Fare collection systems are complicated. It creates barriers for people. Why don't we just, like we say, it's a public service. It benefits everyone, like street lighting or parks. Let's just make it free. What do you think?
Yeah. So, there's lots of interesting dimensions or angles to explore with the free transit debate. I'll start with some of the nice things about it, but then ultimately, I think, end up in a position where it's not something I would recommend doing for practical reasons right now. But philosophically, it is really, really hard to find transportation policies or fare policies that meet all of the needs of the triple bottom line of kind of sustainability planning. So if you think about well, I don't want to take us too off the rails here. sorry for the pun, but you know, if we think about free transit, it achieves a social policy very nicely, right? It creates an affordable means for all citizens to have mobility, right? Without constraint, which is great. Like, that's a huge social win. Environmentally, it's fantastic. It will attract a lot of people out of their cars and into public transit. I say a lot. I don't really have the figures of that. It will attract some people out of their cars and into transit. I think for many people, it's not the costs of transit that make it. For a lot of drivers, you know, they're not necessarily attracted into transit by making it a couple of bucks cheaper, right? There's other reasons why they're driving than taking transit. But there are certainly drivers on the margin who would be attracted to transit if we make it free, and that's great for the environment. And then economically, well, it depends who you ask. It's clearly, it puts a huge revenue strain on the operator and government, who's going to have to subsidize it. So there's an economic, you know, there's definitely a big cost to it economically. But would it be good for the economy is another question. And I think absolutely there's huge gains to be made by creating a more fair transportation system that allows people to move more efficiently, right, and effectively, and without cost barriers. So I think that ultimately free transit has a huge, you know, promise. I think that until a system is properly built out, however, meaning until we have adequate levels of service, I much prefer to see funding being devoted towards the expansion and the improvement of our transit system. So if you ask me, should we do free transit today, which will cost the city of Toronto, you know, an estimated $1.5 to $2 billion a year, right, to make transit totally, an additional $1.5 to $2 billion a year, right, totally free? Would I rather see that money every year being spent to expand our rail network, to expand our BRT system, to invest in more buses, to invest in, you know, expanded and higher levels of service? I think that is actually a far better policy direction to pursue. It will result in higher levels of use in the long run, because I think the major impediment to use for the vast majority of people is not cost, but service quality. We know that to be the case. It will be great for the environment because it will attract more riders than free transit. And it'll be great for the economy because we know that we'll achieve all of those benefits of free transit, you know, but we'll achieve them perhaps even more so by attracting more drivers and more users to use transit in more parts of our city. So given the choice, I really would prefer to see the huge subsidies that we're spending, or the huge subsidy that it would take to make transit totally free, invested into expansion of services. That being said, that doesn't solve the equity issue, and especially the affordability issue, you know, for specifically for people on low incomes, or people who are living in poverty. So I would, if it's going to take $1.5 billion to make transit free, let's take 200 million and make it free for, you know, and get really serious about concessions for people who really have an affordability crunch, and then spend the remainder 1.3 billion on expanding our system every year. And I think after doing that for 15, 20, 30 years, we'll be in a much better position than we would be if we needed to subsidize transit for everyone. Many transit users don't need a subsidy. You and I don't need a subsidy, right? But we would get one under the free transit thing. You know, that's also inefficient. So I think over the long run, a much better allocation of resources is to get serious about low-income concessions, very, very serious, and at the same time focus that extra money onto expanding services and improving service delivery.
Well, that's fantastic, and you really tied it up neatly in a great package for whichever transit agency is listening to you today, and tying that back to the idea of giving up on grabbing cash up front and making it more of a pay-as-you-go experience, and also very, very precisely and carefully experimenting with distance-based fares through an equity lens. So to lower the price of short trips and to really think about the experience of those who use transit for all their mobility needs or most of their mobility needs, and do not have the means to buy a car, to have the options that a lot of us enjoy. So, Stephen, it's been a pleasure. I think you packaged a lot of great advice very, very well. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks for the great questions and the great conversation. And it's been a pleasure. And it was nice to speak with you today.
Thanks, Stephen.